They expected, as at Tenerife, to see the horizon level with the eye, but instead of distinguishing a marked limit between the two elements, the different strata of water seemed to be transformed into vapor, and mingled with the aerial ocean. The western drone of the saddle concealed from them the view of the town of Caracas, but they distinguished the nearest house is the village of Chacao and Petare, the coffee plantations, and of course the Rio Guaira, a slender streak of water reflecting a silvery light. While they were examining with their glasses that part of the sea, the horizon of which was clearly defined in the chain of mountains of Ocumare, behind which began the unknown world of Orinoco and the Amazon, a thick fog from the plains rose to the elevated regions, first filling the bottom of the valley of Caracas. The vapors, illuminated from above, presented a uniform tint of milky white. The valley seemed overspread with water and looked like an arm of the sea, of which the adjacent mountains formed the steep shore. Seated on a rock, Humboldt was determining the dip of the needle, which he found his hands covered with a species of hairy bee, a little smaller than the honeybee of the north of Europe. These insects make their nests in the ground. The people in these regions call them little angels, because they seldom sting. The fog became so dense that it would have been imprudent to remain any longer. So they descended in what was now 4:30 in the afternoon. Satisfied with the success of their journey, they forgot that there might be danger in descending in the dark, steep declivities covered by a smooth and slippery turf. The mist concealed the valley from them, but they distinguished the double hill of the gate, which, like all objects lying almost perpendicularly beneath the eye, appeared extremely near. They relinquished their design of passing the night between the two summits of the saddle, and I, having again found the path that they cut through the thick wood, they soon arrived at the little wood already mentioned, as there is scarcely any twilight in the tropics. They passed suddenly from bright horizon daylight to darkness. The moon was on the horizon, but her disk was veiled from time to time by thick clouds, drifted by a cold and rough wind. Rapid slopes covered with yellow and dry grass was now seen in shade, and now suddenly illuminated seemed like the precipice, the depths of which the eye sought in vain to measure. They proceeded onwards in single file, and endeavored to support themselves by their hands, lest they should roll down. The guides who carried their instruments abandoned them successively to sleep on the mountain. Among those who remained with them was a Congo black, who evinced great address, bearing on his head a large dipping needle. He held it constantly steady, notwithstanding the extreme declivity of the rocks. The fog had dispersed by degrees in the bottom of the valley. I and the scattered lights they perceived below caused a double illusion. The steeps appeared more dangerous than they really were, and during 6 hours of continual descent, they seemed to be equally near the farms at the foot of the saddle. They heard regularly, very distinctly, the voices of men and the notes of guitars. Sound is generally so well propagated upwards that in a balloon at the elevation of 18,000 feet, the barking of dogs is sometimes heard. They did not arrive until 10 at night at the bottom of the valley. They were overcome with fatigue and thirst, having walked for 15 hours, nearly without stopping. The soles of their feet were cut and torn by the asperity of a rocky soil and the hard and dry stalks, for they had been obliged to pull off their boots, the soles having become too slippery. They passed the night at the foot of the saddle. On the 7th of February, they departed from Caracas en route for the banks of the Orinoco. Nothing worthy of note happened for several days. Not far from the village of Turamuro, they discovered at a league distance, like an object, which appeared at the horizon, like a round hillock or tumulus, covered with vegetation. It was neither a hill nor a group of trees close to each other, but one single tree, the famous Zamang del Guare, known throughout the province for the enormous extent of its branches, which formed a hemispheric head 576 feet in circumference. The zamag is a fine species of mimosa, and its tortuous branches are divided by bifurcation. Its delicate and tender foliage was agreeably relieved on the azure of the sky. They stopped a long time under this vegetable roof. The trunk of the Zamag del Guare was only 60 feet high and 9 thick. Its real beauty consisted in the form of its head. The branches extended like an immense umbrella and bent toward the ground, from which they remained at a uniform distance at 12 or 15 feet. The circumference of this head was so regular that, having traced different diameters, Humboldt found them 192 and 186 feet. One side of the tree was entirely stripped of its foliage, owing to the drought, but on the other side there remained both leaves and flowers. Parasites covered its branches and cracked its bark. The inhabitants of the adjacent villages, particularly the Indians, held in great veneration the Zamag del Guare, which the first conquerors found almost in the same state as it now remains. Humboldt considered it at least as old as Otorava dragon tree. On the 21st in the evening, the travelers set out for Guacara and Nueva Valencia. They preferred traveling by night on account of the excessive heat of the day. The road, which bordered with large zamzang trees, the trunks of which rose 60 feet high, their branches nearly horizontal, met at more than 150 feet distance. The night was gloomy. The Rincon del Diablo, with its denticulated rocks, appeared from time to time at a distance, illuminated by the burning of the savannas, or wrapped in ruddy smoke. At the spot where the bushes were the thickest, the horses were frightened by the yell of an animal which seemed to follow them closely. It was a large jaguar, which had roamed for 3 years among these mountains. He had constantly escaped the pursuits of the boldest hunters, and had carried off horses and mules from the midst of the enclosures, but having no want of food, had not yet attacked men. The black who conducted the travelers uttered wild cries, expecting by these means to frighten the jaguar, but his efforts were ineffectual. On the morning of the 27th, they visited the hot springs of La Turinchira, next to the springs of Uringino in Japan. The waters of La Turinchira are the hottest in the world. Humboldt and Bonpland breakfasted near them, and found the eggs were plunged into the water, boiled in less than 4 minutes. The heat became stifling as they approached the coast. The reddish vapor filled the horizon. It was near sunset, and the breeze was not yet stirring. The river of hot water among the banks of which they passed became deeper. A crocodile more than 9 feet lay long dead on the strand. Humboldt wished to examine its teeth on the inside of its mouth, but having been exposed to the sun for several weeks, it exhaled a smell so fetid that he was obliged to relinquish his design and remount his horse. Between Porto Cabello and the valleys of Argua, they saw a remarkable tree. They had heard several weeks before of a tree, the sap of which was a nourishing milk. It was called the cow tree. They assumed sure that the blacks who drank plentifully of this vegetable milk considered it a wholesome ailment. All of the milky juices of the plant became acrid, bitter, and more or less poisonous. This account appeared to them to be very extraordinary, but they found by experience during the stay in the neighborhood that the virtues of this tree had not been exaggerated. It rose like the broad-leafed star apple. Its oblong and pointed leaves, rough and alternate, were marked by lateral ribs prominent at the lower surface and parallel. Some of them were 10 inches long. They did not see the flower. The flower was somewhat fleshy and contained 1 or 2, sometimes two nuts. When incisions were made in the trunk, it yielded an abundance of glutinous milk, tolerably thick, devoid of all acridity, and of agreeable and balmy smell. The travelers drank considerable quantities of it in the evening, before they went to bed, and very early in the morning, without feeling the least injurious effect. The blacks and the free people who worked in the plantations drank it, dipping it into their bread or maize or the cassava. The overseer of the farm told Humboldt that the blacks grew sensibly fatter during the season when it furnished them with the most milk. It was at the rising of the sun that this vegetable fountain was at the most abundant. The blacks and the natives were then seen hastening from all the quarters, furnished with large bowls to receive the milk, which grew yellow and thickened at its surface. Some emptied their bowls under the tree itself. Others carried the juice home to their children. They left the valley of Argua at sunrise on the 6th of March. They were weary of admiring the fertility of the soil covered with calabashes, watermelons, and plantains. The rising of the sun was announced by a distant noise of the howling monkeys approaching a group of trees. They saw numerous bands of monkeys these monkeys moving as in procession and very slowly from one tree to another. A male was followed by a great number of females, several of the latter carrying their young on their shoulders. The howling monkeys, which live in the society different parts of America, anywhere resemble each other in this manner, though the species was not always at the same. The uniformity with which they perform their movements is extremely striking. However, whenever the branches of neighboring trees do not touch each other, the male who leads the party suspends himself by the callous and prehensile parts of his tail, and letting fall the rest of his body, swings himself till in one of his oscillations he reaches the neighboring branch. The whole file performs the same movement on the same spot. The Indians told the travelers that when the monkeys filled the forest with their howling, there were always one that chanted as the leader of the chorus. During a long interval, one solitary and strong voice was generally distinguished, till its place was taken by another voice of a different pitch. The missionaries asserted that when a female among them was on the point of bringing forth The choir suspended its howlings till the moment of the birth on the young. At the Guige, they lodged with an old sergeant, a native of Murcia, a man of very original character. To prove to them that he had studied among the Jesuits, he recited the history of the creation of the world in Latin. He knew the names of Augustus, Tiberius, and Diocletian, and while enjoying the agreeable coolness of the nights in an enclosure planted with bananas, he employed himself in reading all the related to the courts of Roman emperors. He inquired of Humboldt for a remedy for the gout, from which he had suffered severely. "I know," said he, "a Zambo of Valencia, a famous curioso who would cure me, but the Zambo would expect to be treated with attentions which I cannot pay to a man of his color, so I prefer remaining as I am." In the Mesa de Pavia, in the 9th degree of latitude, they entered the basin of Llanos. The sun was almost at its zenith. The earth, however, wherever it appeared, sterile and destitute of vegetation, was at the temperature of 118 or 122 degrees. Not a breath of air was felt at the height of which they were on the mules. Yet in the midst of this apparent calm, whirls of dust incessantly arose, driven on by small currents of air which glided over the surface of the ground, and were occasioned by the difference of temperature between the naked sand and the spots covered with grass. These sand winds augmented their suffering heat of air. Every grain of quartz, hotter than the surrounding air, radiated heat in all directions. It was difficult for Humboldt to observe the temperature of the atmosphere owing to the particles of sand striking against the bulb of the thermometer. All around the plains seemed to ascend into the sky, and the vast and profound solitude appeared like an ocean covered with seaweed. The ocean in some parts was clear and distinct, in other parts it appeared undulating and sinuous, as if striped. The earth, the air was confounded with the sky. Through dry mist and strata of vapor, the trunks of palm trees were seen from afar, stripped of their foliage and of their verdant summits, and looking like the massive ships descried upon the horizon. There was something awful as well as sad and gloomy in the uniform aspect of these steppes. Everything seemed motionless. Scarcely did a small cloud passing across the zenith and denoting the approach of the rainy season cast its shadow on the earth. The chief characteristic of these steppes was the absolute want of hills and inequalities, the perfect level of every part of the soil, often within a distance of 30 square leagues. There was not an eminence of a foot high. After having passed 2 nights on horseback and sought in vain by day for some shelter from the heat of the sun beneath the tufts of the palm trees, they arrived at a little farm. It was a solitary house in the steppes, surrounded by a few small huts covered with reeds and skins. The cattle, oxen, horses, and mules were not penned, but wandered freely over an extent of several square leagues. There was nowhere any enclosure. Men, naked to the waist, armed with lances, rode over the savannas to inspect the animals, bringing back those that had wandered too far from the pastures of the farm, and branding all those that did not already bear the mark of the proprietor. The mulattoes were partly freedmen and partly slaves. They were constantly exposed to the burning heat of the tropical sun. Their food was meat dried in the air and a little salted, and of this even their horses sometimes partook. Being always in the saddle, they fancied they could not make the slightest excursion on foot. The travelers found an old black slave who managed to farm in the absence of his master. He told them of herds composed of several thousand cows. They were grazing in the steppes. Yet they asked in vain for a bowl of milk. They were offered in a calabash some yellow, muddy, and fetid water drawn from a neighboring pool. The indolence of the inhabitants of Llanos was such that they did not dig wells, though they knew almost everywhere at 10 feet deep that fine springs were found. After suffering during one half of the year from the effect of inundations, they quietly resigned themselves during the other half to the most distressing deprivation of water. The old black advised the travelers to cover the cup with a linen cloth and drink as through a filter. Though they might not be accommodated by the smell, they might swallow less of the yellowish mud suspended in the water. As soon as their instruments were unloaded, they let the mules go to search for water, a common custom in the Llanos. They followed them till they came to one of the pools drawn from which the water that had drunk was drawn. They longed impatiently to take a bath, but found only a great pool of petulant water surrounded by palm trees. The water was turbid, though a little cooler than the air. Accustomed during their long journey to bathe wherever they had the opportunity, often several times in a day, they hastened to plunge into the pool. They had scarcely begun to enjoy the coolness of the bath when a noise from which they heard the opposite bank made them leave the water precipitately. It was an alligator plunging into the mud. They were only at a distance of a quarter of a league from the farm, yet they continued walking more than an hour without reaching it. They perceived too late that they had taken a wrong direction, having left it at the decline of the day. Both the stars were visible and had gone forward into the plain at hazard. They were provided with a compass, and it might have been easy for them to steer their course for the position of the Canopus and the Southern Cross, but unfortunately they were uncertain whether, on leaving the farm, they had gone towards the east or the south. They attempted to return to the spot where they had bathed, and again walked 3/4 of an hour without finding the pool. They sometimes thought they saw fire on the horizon, but it was the light of rising stars enlarged by the vapors. After having wandered a long time in the savannah, they resolved to seat themselves beneath the trunk of a palm tree in a spot perfectly dry, surrounded by short grass. This could not flatter themselves in that their guides would come in and search for them in the savannah before they had prepared their food and finished their repast. While somewhat perplexed by the uncertainty of their situation, they were agreeably affected by hearing from afar the sound of a horse advancing toward them. The rider was an Indian armed with a lance who had just made the round in order to collect the cattle. The sight of two white men who said they lost their way led him at first to suspect some trick. They found it difficult to inspire him with confidence, so at last consented to guide them to the farm, but without slacking the gentle trot of his horse. Their guides assured them that they had already begun to be uneasy about them, and to justify this inquietude, they gave a long enumeration of persons who, having lost themselves in the Llanos, had been found nearly exhausted.